let's kick off. So my name is Mark Trencham. I'm a senior research officer and departmental lecturer here in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. And welcome to the second in our seminar series, Modern Methods in Social Policy and Intervention Research. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Tasha Fairfield from the London School of Economics, who's going to be talking on Bayesian reasoning for qualitative social science. Tasha is an associate professor in the Department of International Development at the LSE, and she holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in Latin American Studies and an MS in Physics from Stanford University. So she's had a very varied and interesting academic career. Tasha's first book, Private Wealth and Public Revenue in Latin America, Business Power and Tax Politics, won the Latin American Studies Association's Donna Lee Van Cott Award. Her methodology articles include explicit Bayesian analysis for process tracing, published in 2017 with A.E. Charman, which won the American Political Science Association's Qualitative and Multi-Method Research SAGE Best Paper Award. And her book that is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, written again with A.E. Charman, is Social Inquiry and Bayesian Inference, Rethinking Qualitative Research. So really, really looking forward to Tasha's talk, as I'm sure that you all are. Tasha's going to speak for about 20 minutes to start with. Tasha, I think that's right. And then, so I think the first part, and I'll let you explain, Tasha, but I think the first part will be kind of a conceptual overview, and then we'll have a short period for some questions about that, and then some more practical applications, and we'll have another Q&A session at the end. So stay on your toes, everyone, and get your questions ready, and we'll, so there'll be a sort of break in the middle for some questions if you've got clarification over that stuff. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking because you didn't come to listen to me talk, and I'm going to hand over, if I may, to Tasha. Welcome, Tasha, to the department.
Well, great, and thank you so much for the invitation. This material has really been my research and my teaching passion for the past 5 years, so I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to present it to a broad audience. So the overarching idea here is that the way we intuitively approach case studies is similar to how we read detective novels. So we want to explain what happened, whether that is who killed Samuel Ratchet or how did democracy emerge in South Africa. We're going to consider different hypotheses along the way, drawing on our own imagination and the literature we've read. So that might include other Agatha Christie novels or literature that we're familiar with on regime change. As we gather evidence and we discover clues, we're going to revise our confidence or our views about which hypothesis best explains what's going on. Bayesianism provides sort of a natural framework to govern how we should update our initial views about the plausibility of hypotheses in light of the new information that we learned during our research. So Bayesianism really has a lot to offer qualitative research. It gives us a rigorous methodological foundation for inference in case studies. It mirrors the way that we naturally approach inference, but it also helps us avoid cognitive biases that can lead to sloppy reasoning. And it can be very useful for building consensus and promoting knowledge accumulation. Bayesianism tells us that we should be asking if disagreements about inferences are stemming from different initial views about which hypothesis is more plausible, and given that everyone is going to bring really different background knowledge to the table. Or if scholars are assessing the inferential weight of the evidence differently, why do their assessments diverge, and which line of reasoning about the evidence is more compelling? Even if we can't entirely resolve the disagreements, Bayes can at least help us come out with a better understanding of where and why we disagree. I'm going to start by overviewing some conceptual foundations of Bayesianism. Then I'll explain how we recommend applying Bayesian reasoning in social science. I'll give a couple applications from my work on taxation, And I'll end by highlighting some additional selling points of this approach in terms of what it can do for qualitative research. My co-author and I are drawing on what's called the school of probability as extended logic, which comes out of the physical sciences. And logical Bayesianism conceptualizes probability as the rational degree of belief that we should hold in a proposition, given the information that we possess, which is always going to be limited. So physicists, including Cox and Jaynes, proved that probability theory is the unique extension of deductive logic, where we can know for sure whether all of our propositions are true or false, to situations where information is incomplete and we are unsure about whether various propositions are true or false. So the idea is that probability is a logical construct to help us reason under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information. This is very different from the notion of probability that underpins frequentist classical statistics. So there, probability is understood in terms of the relative frequency of some event in a series of random trials or repeated experiments. So a canonical example would be you flip a coin over and over and over again. How often does heads come up? The Bayesian approach has a lot of advantages. So first of all, it allows us to directly ask the kind of question that is usually of central interest, which is how plausible is the hypothesis given the evidence? In contrast, frequentism cannot apply the notion of probability to a hypothesis. It's not something that varies across repetitions of an experiment. The next 3 points are especially important for qualitative research. Bayesianism is well suited for explaining unique events and for working with a small number of cases. It allows us to analyze limited amounts of data, and it lets us use data that cannot naturally be thought of as coming out of some kind of random or stochastic process. For example, if we are using interviews with key informants to understand policymaking decisions or to understand what was going on during an electoral campaign, there's really no way that we can think of that information as coming from some kind of stochastic process, and it doesn't make sense to try to analyze it with frequentist statistics. Another advantage is that Bayesianism applies the same inferential logic to all kinds of data, including both quantitative data and qualitative data. And then finally, in the words of Laplace, probability theory is simply common sense reduced to calculation. So it is much more intuitive and much more similar to the way that we go about thinking about probability and inference in our daily lives. Mathematically, we use the notation of conditional probability to express our degree of belief in a hypothesis, given whatever relevant information we know. So the probability of H given I represents how confident we are that this hypothesis H is true in light of information I or conditional on information I. And Bayes' role is going to tell us how to update our probabilities in light of new information. Inference always involves comparing hypotheses, so we are using the relative odds version of Bayes' rule. So on the left side of the equation, we have the posterior odds in favor of H1 relative to H2, given the evidence that we've obtained and our initial background knowledge I. So we're asking, what are the odds in favor of H1 relative to H2 in light of all the information that we know at the end of our study. The first term on the right is the prior odds. Right, so we're asking here, how likely or how plausible is hypothesis 1 relative to hypothesis 2 in light of our background knowledge alone? So from the outset, how strongly do we favor H1 over H2? And then the second term is the likelihood ratio. So here we're asking, how probable is the evidence if H1 is true relative to how probable is the evidence if H2 is in fact true? And I just want to emphasize here that, there's my cursor. In this notation of conditional probability, we take everything to the right of the vertical bar to be true when we are evaluating the probability of the proposition that comes to the left of the vertical bar. Evaluating likelihood ratios is the key inferential step that tells us how to update the odds on our hypotheses. Here we have to ask, how likely would we be to find this evidence E in a hypothetical world where H1 is true, as compared to an alternative hypothetical world where H2 is true? The evidence is going to favor whichever hypothesis makes it more likely, or whichever hypothesis makes that evidence more expected. And Bayes' rule tells us that whatever the odds, whatever the prior odds were on our hypothesis, we are going to gain more confidence in the hypothesis that makes the evidence more expected. Here's an overview of our guidelines for applying Bayesian reasoning in qualitative research. We start by considering a pair of mutually exclusive hypotheses. We're going to assess our prior odds, go get some evidence, evaluate likelihood ratios for the evidence, and then we're going to update our prior odds in favor of whichever hypothesis makes the evidence that we found more expected. I'm going to go through each of these in turn with a few little examples along the way. So first up, it's very important to define clearly specified mutually exclusive hypotheses. And this I'm going to do by example. Suppose you want to figure out who ate all the cookies in the cookie jar, and your working hypothesis is the dog. People often want to compare the working hypothesis directly to its logical negation, not H. But this actually does not work except in very simple situations, because not H could include a whole range of different possibilities. If the dog didn't do it, who did? Was it your uncle? Was it a burglar? In fact, not H in this instance is equivalent to asserting that one of the 7 billion other cookie-eating creatures on Earth committed this crime. We need to be specific about what options we consider plausible. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to think about the likelihood of the evidence conditional on this hypothesis, not H, because not H is actually an amalgamation of many, many, many very different kinds of worlds. So for example, we might decide that the dog and the 5-year-old are the only plausible suspects. These two hypotheses, as I've written them, are deliberately and explicitly constructed to be rivals, meaning that only one of them can be true. So if the dog ate all the cookies alone, then the 5-year-old could not have been involved in any way, and vice versa. If we think it's plausible that both the dog and the 5-year-old might have contributed to this outcome, we can pose additional possibilities. So maybe they colluded, or maybe each one of them contributed independently to this empty cookie jar outcome. These 4 hypotheses are still mutually exclusive because only one of them can be true. Each of these is postulating a distinct possible world where a different explanation holds. Our task is then going to be to figure out which of these hypothetical worlds best approximates the one reality in which we're living. And we're going to do that by looking for evidence that discriminates among them. So the main point that I want to make here is that we are free to make our hypotheses as complex as we want. We just have to articulate them carefully so that we actually have distinct rival explanations to compare. I'm going to skip this for now and go on to talk about priors. So once we have our hypotheses articulated, the next step is to assign prior odds. The goal, at least in theory, is to assign probabilities that are objectively grounded in the information that we possess. But in practice, we can't systematically incorporate all of our background knowledge into our priors because there's just too much. So the goal then becomes providing a reasonably concise but thoughtful justification for why we prefer one hypothesis relative to a rival from the outset. And we want to try to highlight those elements of our background knowledge that sort of matter the most for our judgment. Another option is to simply use indifference priors, which usually means even odds. And in this case, the inference will be driven by the likelihood ratio. This is a reasonable approach, again, because everyone's going to have really different background information. But if we focus on likelihoods, we can hopefully at least agree on which hypothesis becomes more likely in light of the evidence that we presented. And if the evidence is strong enough, then scholars who start with very different prior odds may end up with posteriors that all favor the same hypothesis. Whichever approach we use, we can also do some sensitivity analysis to assess how much our conclusions would change if we start from different prior odds. The next task is then to identify evidence. And evidence can be any observation that bears on the truth of the hypotheses. It can be information from interviews, and documents, and news articles. It could be participant observation. I put up some examples here from my work on taxation. My field work involved looking through newspaper articles and congressional records and doing a lot of elite interviews. But this certainly doesn't exhaust the possibilities. So the idea is that we are social science detectives, and we want to go out and get our hands on anything and everything we can that's going to help us figure out which hypothesis is the best explanation. A second important point, what matters is the probative value of the evidence, not the quantity. So in other words, evidence is to be weighed, not counted. It could be that a large amount of evidence ultimately does not allow us to make strong conclusions about which hypothesis is correct. On the other hand, it could be that just one or two very strong, very decisive pieces of evidence might substantially boost our confidence in one hypothesis relative to rivals. So the goal is to find decisive evidence that weighs strongly in favor of one hypothesis relative to rivals. And the way that we figure out how strongly the evidence supports one hypothesis over rivals is to evaluate likelihood ratios. So again, this is the key inferential step that tells us how to update the prior odds on our hypotheses. Here, we need to mentally inhabit the world of each hypothesis in turn and ask, how plausible would the evidence be in that world? If the evidence seems expected, then that's going to be a high probability, high likelihood. If the evidence seems surprising, then that's going to be low probability. The evidence is going to favor whichever hypothesis makes it seem more expected, and we're going to gain confidence in that hypothesis to the extent that it makes the evidence more likely as compared to the rival that we're considering. So I want to do here a quick example from John Snow's work on cholera. So this was the 1854 Soho cholera outbreak. We're going to consider two rivals from Snow's time. So the outbreak was caused either by breathing noxious air, which people called a miasma, or it was caused by drinking contaminated water. So we've got an airborne transmission versus a waterborne transmission hypothesis. Snow found in his research that nearly all of the deaths had taken place within a short distance of this famous Broad Street pump. And further investigation revealed that there was no significant incidence of cholera in this part of London, except among people who were in the habit of drinking water out of this pump. So the picture on the right is a map that Snow drew. I have circled the Broad Street pump in red in the middle. And then the stacked black rectangles represent the incidence of cholera deaths, the number of cholera deaths in households at the particular location on the map. Intuitively, it is probably pretty clear which hypothesis this evidence favors, but I want to go through the Bayesian reasoning. If we start by imagining a world where the miasma hypothesis is true, then this evidence would be very surprising. We would instead expect a much more diffuse pattern of cholera deaths across this region if the disease is being transmitted by air, by a noxious gas. To make sense of the evidence in this world, we would have to suppose that the wind patterns made that miasma oddly concentrated in a pattern that sort of maps onto these areas of high mortality in the picture. But that seems really unlikely. So this evidence is much more expected in the world of the water hypothesis. And in fact, this is exactly the kind of thing that we would expect if people are contracting cholera by drinking contaminated water out of their neighborhood pump. So this evidence strongly favors the water hypothesis. What we do when we evaluate likelihood ratios is to think about the most plausible scenario that would lead us to observe the evidence in a particular world, and then ask whether that story would be more or less likely, more or less plausible than the most sensible scenario that we can imagine in the alternative world. I should emphasize that at this stage, we have to set aside any prior skepticism that we might have about one of the hypotheses. So however implausible we might think the miasma hypothesis is, we have to take the world of that hypothesis seriously. So assuming that hypothesis is true, how expected or alternatively, how surprising would the evidence seem in that world? Would the events and the statements that are contained in the evidence follow plausibly and naturally in the world of that hypothesis? Or would they seem unusual and unexpected? Would they have to be considered as flukes or coincidences? So flukes or coincidences are low probability events. It might be useful to think in terms of willing suspension of disbelief. When you watch a movie about superheroes or time travel, the imagined world might seem really implausible. But if you nevertheless accept that world for the time being, then you want that story to feel compelling and self-consistent. These are the basic guidelines for evaluating likelihood ratios, and the book includes some additional guidance for doing this as well. To review, I've been describing how to heuristically apply Bayesian reasoning in qualitative research. We start by considering a pair of rival hypotheses. We assess our prior odds on those hypotheses by asking how plausible is one relative to the other in light of our background knowledge. We find some evidence and we evaluate likelihood ratios. So we're going to mentally inhabit the world of each hypothesis in turn, and we're going to ask which hypothesis makes this evidence more expected. And then according to Bayes' rule, we will gain more confidence in whichever hypothesis does in fact make that evidence more expected. So let me pause there and see if there are any clarification questions before I go on to the next part of the talk, where I'll show you some applications from my tax research.
I'm going to, since I've got the opportunity, I will ask a quick question if I can, Tasha, which is just about, and maybe you'll talk about this when you go through the practical examples, but I'm just wondering about the kind of likelihood ratios and so forth. I guess I'm kind of wondering how you come up with numbers for those things, and also kind of whether that really matters, or do the exact values really matter, or does it kind of come down to kind of balance of probability and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so what I'm presenting today is we call that heuristic Bayesian reasoning, where we're not actually quantifying, we're just sort of using plain language to describe, does the evidence strongly favor, weakly favor, moderately favor one hypothesis over the other. And that in itself, I think, can do a lot for qualitative research. But if you are working with multiple pieces of evidence and you want to apply Bayesian reasoning more systematically, then you do need to quantify probabilities. And one of the reasons that I've put in bold the likelihood ratios here is that this is really the most important step for heuristic Bayesian reasoning, and we can't really update terribly systematically if we're working with multiple pieces of evidence unless we go ahead and quantify. So we call that a quantified Bayesian analysis. We call that explicit Bayesian analysis to distinguish it.
Okay.
And we have lots of guidelines about how to go about quantifying probabilities in qualitative research in order to be able to use this framework a bit more explicitly.
Right, okay, thank you. That's really, really helpful. And we've had I think one comment from Lorna who says explanations so far have been very clear. Thank you. So I think we'll take that as a thumbs up. You can continue, Tasha.
Great.
That's great. Thanks ever so much.
Great. Okay, glad to hear it. So let's go on and talk about a couple social science applications. So in my previous work, I aim to explain how and when highly unequal democracies can tax economic elites. I argue that business preferences shape policy decisions when either instrumental power or structural power is strong. Instrumental power entails capacity for political engagement, whereas structural power has to do with market reactions and concern over investment. The idea is that structural power requires no organization or concerted political action. Instead, market signals coordinate how firms and investors react in the economic arena. If policymakers think a reform is going to hurt investment, they may rule it out for fear of harming growth and employment. Business power explains the great majority of the tax reforms that I study in the book, but on rare occasion, popular mobilization counterbalanced business power and drove progressive tax increases. Social movement demands can play an indirect role by creating revenue pressure, and they can potentially create a direct role as well if they are explicitly demanding higher taxation of economic elites. The first case that I want to talk through here involves surprisingly marginal tax reform in Chile under a center-left government that wanted more revenue to finance redistributive social spending. I argue that businesses' instrumental power was the main factor that deterred tax increases, namely strong organization and ties to conservative parties in Congress. The government anticipated that trying to increase taxes would be politically infeasible and simply not worth the battle, even though they did not think that higher taxes would hurt investment. The salient rival hypothesis holds instead that the government didn't push harder on the tax front because, first and foremost, because they were worried about investment. If we take our background information to include the facts that business did indeed have a very strong economy-wide peak association that coordinated lobbying across sectors, along with close partisan linkages to the right-wing coalition that held a majority in the Senate, and if we consider that Chile was a small open market economy, then these two hypotheses would be more or less equally plausible a priori. Here's a first piece of evidence. Business leaders regularly warned that tax increases would hurt investment. At first glance, it might seem like this evidence supports the structural power hypothesis because it speaks to the issue of investment. But to make a good inference, we need to carefully inhabit the world of each of these hypotheses. Starting with the structural power world, the evidence would be expected. If the government is concerned that tax increases will hurt investment, then it's quite plausible that business would be thinking and saying the exact same thing. One could imagine in this world that there might not be any need for business to be talking about how bad tax increases are if the government is already worried about investment. But it's hardly unusual for business to voice its views on taxation. In fact, this happens regularly, pretty much everywhere. And in this case, it's a good way for business to periodically remind the center-left coalition of their concerns over investment. So I would say the evidence is expected in this world. If we inhabit the world of the instrumental power hypothesis, the evidence is also expected. Business complains about tax increases all the time as a deterrent strategy, whether or not they would actually change their investment behavior in response to reform, and whether or not policymakers actually think that a tax increase would hurt growth and employment. In the instrumental power world, we might expect business to primarily use their organizational resources and their ties to the right parties to resist any tax increases that might come onto the agenda. But it also makes a lot of sense for business to publicize their policy positions and to use this framing about investment to make their opposition to taxes sound legitimate. In essence, railing against taxes is a sensible business strategy, regardless of which hypothesis correctly describes the government's thought process. I would say that evidence is more or less equally plausible under each hypothesis, so it does not discriminate. It does not provide any inferential weight in favor of one or the other. This is a good example of an important Bayesian lesson. Evidence that is consistent with a hypothesis does not necessarily support that hypothesis. It all depends on how much more or less likely the evidence is under the rival hypothesis at hand. Here's the second piece of information that is more informative. The finance minister told me, if you compare the tax structure of Chile with that of other countries, you will see that the proportion of indirect taxes as a share of the total tax burden is very high, and the proportion of direct taxes is very, very low. And that is because of a political problem. Let's start out in the instrumental power world. So here, the evidence is plausible. What the finance minister has said is entirely compatible with that hypothesis, which emphasizes the political infeasibility of reform. But in the structural power world, the evidence would be surprising. We would instead expect the finance minister to talk about market constraints or concerns that higher direct taxes would discourage investment. But instead, he's suggesting that higher direct taxes would actually be desirable, and he's talking about a political problem rather than an economic problem. It seems unlikely that the finance minister would have any incentives to distort the truth in this structural power hypothesis world. Policymakers tend to be really quite open in sharing any concerns that they have about investment. I would say that this evidence strongly favors instrumental power over structural power. And as it turns out, the broader body of evidence from my research on this case accumulates to weigh very strongly in favor of instrumental power over structural power. Tax politics in Chile changed dramatically after 2010 to the extent that the right-wing Piñera administration actually increased the corporate tax a bit. In this case, I argue that sustained and disruptive student protests counterbalanced business power and motivated economic elites to accept redistributive policies with minimal resistance for the sake of restoring social peace and precluding pressure for even more radical reforms. As a little bit of context here, these were the largest and the most sustained protests in post-dictatorship Chile. The students got a lot of support from public opinion, and they linked their education agenda to the broader issue of inequality. Demand for education reform not only created massive new revenue needs, but the students also explicitly called for the government to finance reform by taxing the richest families and businesses. Here's a rival hypothesis that a reviewer suggested. So it identifies technocrats rather than social mobilization as the impetus behind tax reform. And here's some interview evidence that helps to adjudicate between these two explanations. An executive branch advisor told me that the finance minister was very resistant to the idea of doing a tax reform. He was the main opponent of the tax increase because of the effect that it could have on growth. The president was the one who promoted the design and the decision. This president makes decisions very autonomously, especially on these issues. So let's start with the social mobilization hypothesis, the world of that hypothesis. In this world, we would expect incumbent politicians to pursue modest progressive reforms in line with the students' demands as a means to reestablish social peace and get the students off the street. This evidence does not speak directly to the causal mechanism in the social mobilization hypothesis, but it is consistent with that hypothesis. The president is taking action to enact the reform as we would expect in that world, despite protests from the finance minister who has other concerns, who's motivated by other considerations. But in the technical expertise world, the evidence would be very surprising. We would expect key technocrats like the finance minister, who was a professional economist, to played a central role in proposing and designing and advocating this tax increase. And we would anticipate politicians, including the president, would defer to the finance minister's expertise. But instead, the finance minister resisted the reform and the president ignored his advice. So the evidence is much more plausible under the social mobilization hypothesis, which means that it strongly favors that explanation. This example illustrates that evidence can support a hypothesis without speaking directly to the causal mechanism of that hypothesis. Again, it all depends on how much more or less likely the evidence is under a rival hypothesis. Now that I've given you some sense of how to use Bayesian reasoning, I want to step back and highlight a few of the key selling points in terms of what this method can do for qualitative research. First, Bayesian reasoning helps us make better judgments about the inferential weight of the evidence. I have seen many examples where scholars overestimate the extent to which the evidence they present favors their hypothesis because they do not consider whether that evidence might be equally or even more plausible under a rival hypothesis. And this is actually a common form of confirmation bias that Bayesian reasoning helps us avoid, namely focusing on a single favored hypothesis and forgetting to ask about rivals. Remember, the key step in Bayesian reasoning is precisely to evaluate which of two or more rival hypotheses make the evidence expected. So if we are applying Bayesian reasoning, we cannot accidentally fall into this particular type of confirmation bias. Beyond making us better data analyzers, Bayesianism can also help make us better data collectors. Recognizing that inferential support comes from differential likelihoods under rival hypotheses helps us identify the kinds of evidence to seek that will most efficiently adjudicate among rival explanations. A third important point is that Bayesianism pushes us to make our theories more precise. Hypotheses have to be articulated very clearly if we're going to be able to inhabit the corresponding world and evaluate what kinds of evidence would be expected and what kinds of evidence would be surprising. Reasoning about likelihood ratios can help us identify aspects of our theories that need to be refined or better specified. And that in and of itself can make a big contribution to resolving debates and to promoting knowledge accumulation. Finally, Bayesianism is all about optimal inference from information, from whatever information we actually have, however incomplete that information may be. Even without pandemic constraints, we rarely end up with decisive evidence that allows us to establish that our argument is the best explanation beyond reasonable doubt. That is perfectly fine from a Bayesian perspective, because the goal is to honestly assess how much uncertainty surrounds our conclusions. We're not seeking to prove that our theory is correct. Instead, we're aiming to assess how strongly our posterior odds favor one hypothesis relative to rivals in light of our background knowledge and the evidence that we have managed to collect. I'll end with a brief overview of some of the additional topics that we cover in the book. So I already talked a little bit about the difference between explicit Bayesian analysis and the heuristic reasoning that we have been discussing here. So the book includes guidelines about how to go about quantifying probabilities. We recommend working on a logarithmic scale. I can go into that if you're interested in the Q&A. Bayesianism is usually associated with process tracing in a single case. But Bayesian reasoning works in the same way when we're analyzing multiple cases. We use several examples from comparative historical analysis to illustrate that. I mentioned earlier that Bayesianism can be used for both quantitative data and qualitative evidence. In fact, Bayesianism can serve as a universal framework for inference where we apply the same method for all components of our research. So the posteriors from the first component of our research simply become the priors for the second component of our research. So everything accumulates very nicely within a Bayesian framework. The last part of the book gives a Bayesian perspective on research design. Bayesianism provides a rigorous foundation for iterative research where we go back and forth between theory development, data collection, and data analysis, instead of progressing linearly from theory building to theory testing. This is how qualitative research almost always works, and it is perfectly justified within a Bayesian framework. And finally, Bayesianism provides a single and simple underlying principle for case selection. We should try to choose the cases that are expected to be most discriminating with respect to the hypotheses that we're testing. So I'll end there, and thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to discussing and responding to questions and comments that you may have.
Thank you ever so much, Tasha. That was absolutely fabulous. Really, really clear and concise. You covered so much ground there and so very clearly. Thank you ever so much. That's absolutely brilliant.